let's get started on the struggle, part 4. My family and my childhood, and some of the basis for the things that I believe started to cause some of the mental health issues and depression that I would go through later in my life. So, I was raised primarily in a very amazing family. I had some struggles with certain people, but for the most part, I had a very loving, very good family, and really the kind of people that I think most people hope to be to their children or be raised by, you know. Let's start with my grandparents. My granddad's first. On my dad's side, my grandfather had grown up on a ranch, you know, for my great grandfather, who was a really tough man, you know, had 3 sons and a daughter, and ran a ranch back in the days when being a rancher was, you know, it was rough, you know. My grandfather, probably being the smartest of all his siblings, to be honest, and the most driven, you know, came up a working man without anything being handed to him, and put himself through law school to become a very, very successful attorney. You know, I've never said much to him, and I probably should say more. Me and him, unfortunately, have had a rockier relationship when I've been older due to a lot of things that, honestly, I probably caused. But that grandfather was a hero to me. He still is a hero to me. And, you know, just everything I saw about him growing up was, this is a guy who stands up for what's right. He built this empire for his family, you know. He ended up running a law firm and becoming a county attorney, and, you know, on top of that, had other business ventures on the side and became very, very successful. My family on that side of the curb didn't really ever want for anything, never really struggled, but we weren't taught to be greedy either. You know, my grandfather, coming from where he came from, instilled a serious work ethic and a sense of earning what you have, as well as instilling, you know, what it means to be a good man and carry yourself a certain way. I used to love, you know, sitting back with him and watching cowboy movies, old John Wayne flicks, watching Shane, Clint Eastwood, the good and the bad and the ugly, you know. I remember watching a movie with him, an old John Wayne movie, The Man That Shot Liberty Valance, you know, and getting so excited by that movie and the fact that me and my grandfather watched this movie together that I wanted to be a fucking cowboy, you know. I had to be like 2nd grade or something, a little kid. And my grandmother, literally the next time we went to the city, took me to the Western store and outfitted me with every fucking thing, you know, that she could to make me into this little cowboy. And I was just running around trying to be, you know, little John Wayne for my granddad, you know. In a realistic light, I also always saw him as a real, true sentinel for right, you know. This is a man who spent his life trying to help people as a lawyer. He was a very good lawyer, who did a lot of good for his community and the people around him, and had a few cases in his history where he put some very, very bad people behind bars. Kind of a funny story. I guess not so much for me at the time, but I can look back on it and laugh. I loved my grandfather so much that I wanted to be him so bad, you know. And this is something you'll find is similar between both my grandfathers. I got into my clothes one time when I was a little kid, you know. My dad and I had to go back and live with him for a while after my dad's divorce to get back on our feet and have some family help. And I wanted to be my granddad so bad, you know. I put on this button-up shirt and tried to tie a tie around my neck the best I could and put on these dress shoes that were too big for me and started walking around town, you know, just, I don't know what I was thinking, but just trying to be like my grandpa, you know, trying to be a lawyer. Some neighborhood kids, you know, gave me a rough time and kind of beat me up a little bit for it, but, you know, it's whatever. I look back on it now, and I mean, to have somebody that you look up to that much, who their legacy and what they do in their life means that much to you. I don't know if I've ever explained that to my granddad, but I hope one day he'll get the chance to know how much he meant to me and how much he still means to me these days, even with all the struggle we've been through, you know. His wife, my grandma, taught me tolerance and love and a sense of adventure and enjoyment for life, you know, right off the bat. I had a lot of struggles with my mom, which I'll go into more later, but she really took a big place in my life in that motherhood role, you know. And that grandmother, she's a free spirit, man, you know. I love antiques. I still to this day go to antique shops and all that because my grandma's favorite thing in the world was flea markets and antiques and collecting the old things in life that were beautiful, you know. She was always there to spend money on me and, you know, spoil me and treat me like this little special prince of the family, you know, but she was also a teacher. And, you know, was somebody that had a lot of love for her community and the people that she was around, you know. I went to a junior high school that she taught at for a little bit in my life, and it used to be so embarrassing and hard because, like, I can't get away with anything. My grandma works in this place, you know. Now I look back on it just to see how many of my friends and how many kids I knew and people in the community just loved her because she was one of those teachers that took a real interest in her students and their families. I mean, she used to fly kids to Washington, D.C. every year. I went on that trip, you know. She, on St. Patrick's Day, would dye her hair green and come to school in a kilt, you know. Her room was full of Coca-Cola memorabilia and Wizard of Oz stuff, you know. The kids that knew her loved her. She was voted like top teacher in the state, I think 2 or 3 times, you know. Just an amazing woman who taught me a lot of good, valuable lessons in my life. On the other side, you know, even though me and my mom have our own struggles, her parents were amazing people. They adopted her first off, which, by the way, I'll also say with my dad's mom, you know, my dad and my uncle are biologically her and my grandfather's kids, and then they adopted both my aunts from another country. So between that and my other grandparents who had adopted my mom from a really bad situation that I'll go into in a minute, I learned a lot of tolerance and love and acceptance for other people, you know. And both sides of my family were small town Roman Catholic, so I was raised in a very Catholic family and community, which could be really strict and definitely has difficulties when you're a kid. But, you know, I think a lot of what I grew up having around me was really good structure and taught me a lot of good lessons that I would more or less discover later in my life, you know. My mom's parents, like I said, even though me and my mom aren't particularly close, her parents were always people that I just adored and loved. They were the picture perfect love story to me. You know, what you're supposed to be as a couple. Been together for so many years. I never saw them raise their voice at each other. Never saw them, you know, treat each other bad. Never saw anything but love in them till the day that my grandfather passed away on that side. And still so much love from my grandma for, you know, him and their relationship nowadays. He was a farmer, he became a farmer, or started farming, I believe around like 14 years old, because his father had passed away. And he had other things he wanted to do in his life. He wanted to be in the military. He had interest in being a mechanic. He wanted to leave. He didn't really want to be a farmer, but he embraced it. He made the best out of that life. He built something out of it to take care of his family, and became very successful, and gave my grandmother and my mom the best life that he could and the most love that he could. And he was a man that was absolutely beloved by his community. Never been in the military, never even left the town he was in. And when this man died, there was a procession around his funeral that would have reminded you of something in the military, of a war hero dying, you know? That's how much the town loved him, you know? He was a funny guy. I always remember driving down the road and he'd be playing polka music, you know, and making all these funny sounds that I'm not even gonna try to mimic, because I won't do my grandfather justice, you know. But just always making us laugh as kids in the back of the car and stuff like that. He was always there for me, you know. Even in the times I knew I disappointed him, he never showed any kind of anger towards me. He was the one person in my family they talk about when disappointment is the thing that hurts you more than somebody yelling at you. That was him. I feel the disappointment. And, you know, it made me want to do better. It made me ashamed of my actions. The man was everything to me, just like my other grandfather. On top of wanting to be a lawyer, I just wanted to be a farmer, man, and drive international tractors, because that's what he had and that's what he did. And even though that wasn't the life that he wanted, he just made it everything that I wanted, because that's what he was, you know. My grandma on that side, she taught special education. She was a teacher too, and she was beloved by her students as well. And everybody in her community still is, you know. Amazing, amazing woman. And amazing people. My mom, when she was adopted, came to him when she was older, and came to him with a lot of trauma and mental health issues of her own, which this is kind of where I start on my path to looking into my own mental trauma, because I do believe that some mental trauma can be passed down and can be hereditary. And I think there's things I deal with that definitely come from my mother, you know. For a long time, I hated my mom. I mean, they had me in high school, my dad and my mom, and my dad basically manned up right away to do what needed to be done for us, you know. He graduated high school. He started working as an EMT. He was doing a janitorial job, all of this stuff while he was getting into the Army, but he was doing these things to pay for me and take care of me and build a life for us. He was 18 years old, you know, and he had dreams of playing football. He got hurt his senior year playing football, couldn't do that anymore. Turned around and just became a man and stepped up to be a father and take care of me. Planned on marrying her and take care of her, you know, really loved her. My mom, I think due to a lot of what happened in the past, which I don't know a ton about, but she was adopted at an older age from a family that I know was not very good. There was a lot of abuse from the men in the family. My biological grandfather was apparently a very, very terrible and horrific individual, to the degree that my biological grandmother, from what I know about her, she ended up taking her own life one day just to get out of the cycle of abuse. So I can't imagine how dark and bad things really were. But because of this, the amount of love that my grandparents gave her, it just never was able to regulate the things that she was already dealing with at her age. And I think in an older age, my hatred has turned more to sorrow, but I just think she decided she didn't want to be a mom. And that's not, you know, she was scared. So she left me with my grandparents, I believe when I was like 3, and basically took off, you know. There's a lot more that goes into that later, but I think that was probably the very first real beginnings of struggle in my life, because it left me and my dad on our own, you know. My dad got custody of me. He raised me. He was an amazing father. Amazing. So many things I appreciate about what he did that I didn't back then, and I should have. But I had the greatest father you could ask for, and good grandparents to stand behind him. Really not a lot to complain about, you know. We had my stepmom for a while that my father was married to when we moved to Maryville, Missouri, and he started going to college at Northwest Missouri State. And I really loved her, and I embraced her, and she became another motherly figure in my life. And then another major part of heartbreak, and I think what caused some of my impact, was the day that she basically abandoned me and my father, and decided that, you know, we weren't worth her love anymore. She had an affair on my dad, and it was pretty tragic. It tore him up pretty bad, caused a lot of issues. And, you know, at the end, she ended up leaving to marry the guy she cheated on my dad with. Took my little brother and sister with her. And then me and my dad had to basically go home after the divorce and start from scratch, you know, living with my grandparents. And like I said, although my grandparents did a lot for me, you know, it started to cause this compounding wave of trauma when I was younger. So then we move home to where my grandparents are on my dad's side, and between the things I'm already dealing with, it's also a small town environment where all these kids, for the most part, come from families that have been in this town forever. And, you know, they've kind of grown up together and all that. And I'm new. So I kind of became the outsider, you know. And then dealing with the struggles I was dealing with made me kind of more of an outcast, and I didn't really fit in. But I met one kid in the town named Garrett that I got to be amazing friends with, man. Garrett was like my best friend for years, you know. And then another part of this story that'll become kind of interesting later is that there was another kid named Matt Kenyon I got to be really acquainted with. And me and Matt did not like each other in the beginning. I think the reason, Matt's dad was a cop, and my grandfather was the county attorney, so it's like, we were both the kids from the law enforcement side who were kind of rebelling against our family, and then for whatever reason, as kids, we just hated each other, you know? So we were always bullying each other, picking on each other, getting in fights, you know? But for probably a good 5 or 6 years, Garrett was my best friend. Tore up the town together, leave school, go hang out at each other's houses. I told you I'm a big fan of horror films. And Garrett stole the first horror film I ever watched from like his older sister, and we watched it at his house after school when nobody was home and we weren't supposed to. It was The 13 Ghosts, which is still one of my favorite horror films of all time, and it traumatized the fuck out of me when I watched it as a kid. And then, you know, we got to about junior high age. Me and Garrett started to change a little bit. And, you know, one of the things that really changed was Garrett had started to deal with a lot of struggles from things that were going on in his own life. I don't really want to get into that too much because that's his personal business, you know. But anyway, my dad had also really got his foot sealed where he needed to be, and we were leaving. We were moving back to the city. Where my dad was going to have a good job and we were going to live our life. And then, of course, leaving this small town and going to the city, things became different, you know. All of a sudden, I went from going to school in a small country town where the biggest thing that happens is the county fair and the rodeo, to going to school at, you know, the ghetto side of the tracks in the city where my dad could afford an apartment, you know. all of a sudden I was crossing paths with gangbangers and drug dealers and all that kind of stuff. And I know people like, in Nebraska? Yeah, man, in Nebraska. You know, two other big people I forgot to tell you came from Nebraska is Paint Boy KD and King ISO. Both major rappers nowadays. So yes, Nebraska has some street shit that's going on there, you know. And, you know, I think I just started to kind of rebel. My dad was working all the time to provide for us and make sure that our life could go forward and that, you know, we wouldn't struggle anymore. And so he was gone a lot. He was working. And, you know, I started to get angry about that because me and my dad were always super close. And all of a sudden he wasn't around much anymore. And then going to school in this new environment, you know, you don't want to be the small, weak kid from the farm town. You want to get along with people and be respected and all this. So I started to, you know, kind of walk around with my chest puffed out and get into fights and hang out with kids that were, you know, on the street and in trouble with the street and all this kind of stuff. And still at the same time, I kept a lot of links to, you know, the town that I lived in and all that. Actually, all these years later, me and Garrett had remained friends, but we started to kind of grow farther apart. Me and Matt actually became closer. Him and Garrett became best friends. And then as we were going into high school, every time I'd come back, me and Matt would always see each other and started to be friends, you know. So I want to say it was 2005, February 14th, Valentine's Day of 2005. I came home from school. It was actually the day after Valentine's Day, I'm sorry. And my dad was in tears and crying and came up to hug me and tell me that he was so sorry. And I found out there had been a car accident back in this town, a really, really bad car accident. And Matt and Garrett were killed. My dad gave me the choice, being in high school, to get out of school for the rest of the week and go home for the weekend, stay with my grandparents, and go to the funeral service. This, I believe, is one of the instances that really started to fuck with my head and hurt me. This was the first real loss or losses that I had gone through as a kid, where the people that I lost were young friends, people that were my age, people that I hung out with all the time and I was really close to, and in a lot of other circumstances I could have been with them, you know. This could have been an accident that involved me if it was one of those weekends that I was home and hanging out with them, you know. And then of course I was just very upset that these two people I was really close to had died the way that they did. And the tragedy overwhelmed me. Going home for the funeral service and all this kind of stuff and seeing their moms and their families and crying with everybody was a lot harder for me than I thought it was going to be. And it stuck with me. It was like the first time in my life that I saw death up close. And it really started to stick with me and haunt me. So after this, I really started to have problems. I really started to struggle. And that is where I'm going to leave this part at. And we'll pick it up and continue in the next video. But, you know, like with all the other stuff, like, comment, and subscribe. And, you know, tell me what you think. But I'm going to continue this conversation into the next chapter on the next video and kind of explain what happened after that.